heard of honest Socrates, the man who never lied? They weren't so grateful as you'd think. Instead, the rule is fixed to have him tried and handed him.
Good evening and welcome everybody to SARS's first meeting 2021. Hope you've got through all the trials and tribulations of 2020 and have come out the other side with some good times as well. It certainly is a good time to reflect, seeing that we're back in the Mercury retrograde cycle again. So anyhow, well, tonight we'll start the year off again and have the pleasure of Mr. Greg Clare being, and all I can see you have all your details up on the screen, but being a past, present, well-known astrologer, lecturer, guru of Hellenistic astrology, just to name a few, I think he needs a little introduction. I also want to thank you, Greg, also for your time, as I know you're in the middle of relocating at the moment. So it's been difficult for everybody. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you now. Thank you. Welcome aboard, Greg.
Thank you, Cheryl, and a shout out to the whole of SARS committee for keeping SARS going. It's just so good that you guys have stepped up and doing it. And Cheryl, thank you so much for your commitment that you've put in. That's just excellent. Chris who's in London, Ben in Bondi, aren't you, Ben? Yeah, and thank you, Bob, as well, and all the other contributors to SARS. You know, we're the oldest astrological group in the Southern Hemisphere since 1938, and it's just so good to be presenting material all the time at the Research Society. So a big plug for SARS.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So yeah, well, let's get on with things, eh? Let me. Okay. So if you can't see the screen all that big, because I've been told different screens show different elevations of it, just go to the view up the top, and you can choose whatever you'd like as a view, and that way you'll see, because I'll be using SolarFire in a little while when we do some charts, and because I haven't got them embedded in the PowerPoint, because I've got quite a few, and I discussed with Cheryl just in a quick way that I didn't have time to embed all of the charts, and it would have just been a bit of a laborious task. So I've got them all open on SolarFire. So hopefully when I go to SolarFire and I present the charts, you'll be able to expand the screen to see. If you've got any problems, let Ben know in the chat box, and he might be able to help you out, or at least to let me know where we stand with all that. Okay, that's homework out of the way, so let's get on with things. 2021 World Year 5, and the year of the metal ox, one of the bigger if you like, events of the year, of course, is Uranus collides with Saturn 3 times. I say this is a Titan revolution over time, because Kronos, as I will refer to some of the planets as their Greek names, because it gives it a lot more emphasis about what we're talking about. The established holds tight. So with that, let's get on and have a bit of a look. We'll start off with the year. In reviewing last year, you might have, those that have read my articles from and seen different things that I've put out over the period of time. I said that 2020 was going to be one of those years, and it certainly was. And this is reflective in the numerological aspect that we look at, if you like. The numerological aspect, if you like, for me, what happens is the world expresses itself in, we have a cosmic consciousness or a collective consciousness, and symbols express themselves throughout the if you like, organic planet, Gaia. And when we get an expression of these numerals, we get an archetype from it. And I said last year that it was going to be a special year and we would see a lot of divisions, because I put the planetary aspects, if the planets themselves as archetypes, onto the numerals, and come up with some key words, some grammar to describe that. And last year we had a 4-year with 2020, and it's actually a 22, so it's a prime number in that sense of what we would call a number that's that really doesn't reduce itself down like other numbers do. It's a master number. And so it's the essence of last year was the first principle of 4, of course, is Mars. And the second principle, that if you take into account where we are today with the outer planets of the transpersonals, you get Uranus. So I said it would be a Uranus-Mars year last year. And I wrote that article in 2007, published in the NCGR in 2017 in the US, suggesting that we'd have a really difficult year, and we did have a difficult year, and it could be described as a divisional year. So, you know, since I've been doing this mundane astrology for a long time, I've seen that these, if you like, numerals as archetypes, the expression from a cosmic perspective, especially from a collective perspective, do infiltrate the society in general. And so with that in mind, this year is a 5-year. So the principles behind the 5-year, at least for me, some other numerological schools and different people show different ways of doing things. And that's just one of the things about astrology. But for me, the principles that I use are expressed from the Pythagoreans. We don't know exactly too much about the Pythagoreans, but, you know, in my studies, I see that the numerals within themselves are expressions, if you like, of these archetypes, and 5 is a Mercury archetype. And so I attach grammar to that numeral, and we come up with cognitive expression as the first part here. The word we use to describe Mercury is contestation. And so there's a lot of contestation going about. Information overload, misinformation, internal travel, and Mercury also has a reoccurrence cycle of 20 years. So if you click on your solar fire and go back 20, just press 20 years and go back 20 years, you will see that Mercury 20 years ago, around this time, you might have to go forward or back a couple of days, but around this time, Mercury is exactly the same position in relationship to the sun. And so this is what we call a reoccurrence cycle. So it's important to also kind of throw all this stuff in. And you can see my little South Fork diagrams here, and Hermes here, and this bit of an arch over here. I put a lot of effort into the backgrounds, if you like, as well, because I like to portray the pictures in an archetype as well, because pictures also tell a story. So for us this year, from a world perspective, and what we're going to see as a social expression, brought down first from the collective, then down into nuanced into your own lives, is this cognitive expression. So there'll be a lot of expression in the sense of what we think. So it's important to understand that may have challenging positions, but also positive positions, because that's just the way it is. And that'll be triggered by this ever-moving astronomical clock that we have, because it's the, if you like, what underpins astrology is the astronomy. And we get all our mythological stories from astronomy and the position of the astronomy, and a whole lot of other attributes that are thrown in. So I've already observed, since we clicked the calendar, the Western calendar, this is the Western calendar year over, because Arabic writing is different, it's backwards. We're using the Western calendar, which most of us do use. throughout the world. But then if you look, you're in China or you're in India, well, that might be a little bit different. But the expression that we see from this 5-year has already begun. You know, we're seeing this information overload. We're seeing this contestation, misinformation, the internal travel. So there's some of the things that some of the themes that we're going to see during this year. It's also the year of the metal ox. Last year it was the rat and the cunning rat, and I said quite a few things about that in the lecture last year about the rat. Now we're into the metal ox, and so he's a grumpy, blunt, solid, reliable, jealous, determined, and cautious. Some of the words that I came up with the ox. Think of the ox as ploughing the field, you know, doing the hard work. You know, he's got his head down, he's doing the hard work. So when you come along and disturb him, he's not going to be real happy. So there is a theme we'll build up to here as well, because as you know, the first slide here, the world expression of 5, there's a flexibility in 5 because it's a mercurial number. And so there's that center number, if you like, or there is flexibility because Mercury could do many things. One of the things, as the neo-chump, he could go down into the underworld and come back up. You know, he helped guide the souls into Hades. And so there's that duality attached to Mercury. But then we come to the metal year of the ox, and the ox is quite solid and is reflective of the Aquarian energy that we're going to face this year. You know, through right now, we just clicked over into February, and there's a massive amount of fixed energy at the moment with the Aquarian energy. So the metal ox is, you know, basically it's a hard work year in that sense. But he also, you can see a little division map. He's centered on himself. He's got his work cut out for him. So he's going to be ploughing the field, you know, he's going to be doing what he does. And so he doesn't want to get disturbed. So there's going to be some interesting times ahead when he gets disturbed, which he will. So it's all about air for quite some time, guys. In the article I wrote, and if you remember, those that attended my science versus nature lecture that I did in 2018-19 around the circuit, where I suggested that, you know, 2020 decade was we'd gone into the air, and really it's a kind of a leap into this Aquarian age, really, and all, you know, right on the timing of it all. Last year, around 31st of March, just prior to that, when Saturn went into Aquarius for the first time, and then Mars conjunct Saturn at 0,0 of Aquarius, in that talk where I presented, I said, you know, watch out for these times. These are going to be, you know, we're moving into air. So the simplicity of the element of air is everything air. And so the air we breathe, we see a virus that we've got now, which is a respiratory virus spread through. And interestingly enough, Aquarius as an air sign was also spoken about as a liquid sign, as pouring the knowledge. So it was also connected with, in some degrees, to water. Which is quite strange. It sounds ambiguous, but that's how the ancient astrologers spoke about it. So we are moving into this air element, and I couldn't start the year without going into the 20-year cycle that we have. And we'll go over some of these charts in a little while and have a bit of a look at them. But in the general of this, we've got Aquarius for 20 years, Libra, and then Gemini, and then we go back through it again. You know, we've got a long cycle of 180 to 240 years in each of the elements. And so for the next 20 years, we're in the Aquarian Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0,0 degrees, planetary conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn that happen through different elements over 200-year periods. The way that also comes together in that sense is, where does that degree fall? We know that, and we can look at back in 2000, the degree in 2000 of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on the 28th and 29th of May, depending where you lived in the world, that conjunction was at 22 degrees of Taurus, which is was really significant in its sense. And what's really interesting about that is when we go back to that, we see that Uranus was at 20 degrees of Aquarius at that time. And I wrote an article about that as well. You know, we moved into from the 1999 total solar eclipse. That was the seed sown for this fixed element for the next 20 years we went through. So we went through Jupiter, Saturn in Taurus at 22 degrees. And we saw the rise of that Taurian archetype. And so there was a lot of wealth in the world. There was a lot of people with value in the world. Everything became valued in its sense. Once we got past the initial stage of that confrontation period that we had with Jupiter, Saturn squaring Uranus. And this time it's the opposite way around, which is really interesting because as I said, we had Uranus in Aquarius and Jupiter and Saturn in Taurus. And now we have Uranus in Taurus and we have Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. So, you know, welcome to the juncture position. And so how this plays out would be really interesting, but we can see and look back in retrospect that the Venetian elements of Jupiter and Saturn, as Jupiter as an expansion, Saturn as a contraction, and the archetype of Taurus, the value and the want of everything else grew and grew until the opposition. As soon as Jupiter got the opposition in Scorpio, we had the 2008, 2009, you know, from 2007 to 2009, the world went through this escalating downturn. And so it's important to watch the cycle of these conjunctions over 20 years because they'll give you that key to how things will play out. So in this instance now, with the Jupiter Saturn, they've come into Aquarius at 0 degrees. And as I said, Saturn ingressed into Aquarius in 2020, and then on 31st of March, 1st of April, depending where you were, Mars joined it at 0 degrees. And so that was pretty scary. And the whole year's been very much like that. So we're going to have this continuation through the decade of different planets firing off on those degrees. So the 20 degrees and the 0 degrees will be degrees to watch in those fixed signs as we move through, because they'll hit off things as we move along, and the archetypes will be expressed, especially with China. I gave my talk in 2012 in New Orleans on China in the 21st century and suggested that we were going to see China as I called it the crossroads at that time. And last year, with breaking down the borders, I presented another talk on the looming crossroad with China, because as you'll see, I have a chart that I presented that comes from a time for China that is different from Charles Carter's time of 315. I have it from an autobiography of his physician that comes from Sydney. And within that context of that, I use a 1013 chart. The autobiography by his physician says 10 a.m. that Mao got onto the stage, but with all the commotion and everything else that went on, it seems he proclaimed it somewhere around 10:12 or 10:13 in the morning. That's the chart I use. Now, if you use that chart, why I'm saying that, the significance is it's 0 degrees of Aquarius for their moon. If you use Carter's chart, you've got a 5-degree Aquarius moon, but using the and the ascendant for the chart that I use is 22 or 23. It's 23 degrees of Scorpio, so it puts it on the fixed signs. So it puts the Jupiter Saturn conjunction of 2000 on their 7th house. It puts this conjunction on their moon in their 4th house. And so you get in mundane astrology, you'll get a new expression of how that archetype will play out, especially through the houses, because they're terrestrial. They come down and they give us the topical affairs that we're going to see happen. And China is one of those countries that has fixed signs, regardless if you use my chart or Carter's chart. You have fixed signs on their angles. So their first house, 10th house, 7th house and 4th are fixed signs. And so this year, with the fixed signs of Taurus and Aquarius, you're going to get a real blocking of that energy, which we'll get into in a minute. Does that all make sense, guys?
Mm-hmm.
A little nod there.
Yep.
So that's the great conjunction, which I'll go to the charts in a little while. But what I do, you might see here that I've got the Jupiter-Saturn great conjunction 21st of December 2020 at 6:20:35 UT time. And I've got it at 00 north and 00 west. Now that's called the world, it's got a fictitious name called Null Island. It doesn't exist, except it's a buoy in the ocean off Africa. And what that is that's our prime meridian, meeting our equator. And so as a global unit, collective unit, we symbolize things and do things. And in my astronomy classes, I teach people that the expression of how the unfolding archetypes on this planet unfold is by what we develop as symbols. And so for a long time, we've been using this symbol, and remarkably enough, I'm writing a paper on it, but I can't give too much away, but hence to say that if you have something to say about that in a little while, because remember our celestial equator, our equator projected into the sky becomes the celestial equator. And if we're doing astronomy / we're working with planetary positions and then we express them as archetypes, then we've got to understand that it is the astronomy that is at the base of this. So when we understand the astronomy, we don't have too much more difficulty in expressing the archetypes, because the archetypes just permeate. And you know, we all know what Mars and Saturn mean as archetypes. But and when we do mundane astrology, and if we got a point of reference, and we see that point of reference from this perspective, we can do a forecast for the globe. And then we do the individual charts for the nations, for your city, such and such, so we can take it everywhere else. But because I'm doing this lecture for 2021 and the world, when I do these worldly forecasts, if you like, mundane as we call it, I like to use the 00 coordinates, and they're remarkably enough, they do express that full energy out. And so when we look at the charts, we can see that as well. Interesting enough, if you look at this December chart, you will see the great conjunction here of Jupiter and Saturn is in the 8th house. I use whole sign houses just for the topics. I will use quadrant house systems for different things, but you've got to understand how quadrant houses work to express what that difference might be. But just for topics, I use that. And the 8th house is of course death, other people's money, and resources. And it's also about endings and beginnings. That's one of the most important things about it. It's called the idle house, but it's endings and beginnings. And so you're going to see a lot of that. The 11th house, of course, is the stock market. It's also not only the stock market, it represents the House of Representatives or Congress, depending on it's the lower house of all parliaments, and it's very liberal in its sense. It's the Liberal parties, and you'll see Uranus here. So on the world collective stage, you might see volatility there because you've got Uranus there in that 11th house. So there'll be a lot of speculation and volatility, and I think we're seeing that expressed. And the times that you'll see the expression of that even more, of course, is when the triggers, if you like, the degrees to those, to Uranus and to Saturn and to Jupiter as those planets get activated on those degrees or come into aspect with each other. We describe Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions. Those two planets don't move off the ecliptic very much at all. You know, one something or other degrees for Jupiter and just on 3 degrees or just under 3 degrees for Saturn. So they don't move off the ecliptic very much at all. Mars, what we call the nocturnal planets, Mars and Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, they move up and down over the snake, which I call the ecliptic, is what I named as the ecliptic. And you've seen me in many of my lectures at SARS itself describe that dragon, you know, the node. And when planets cross the ecliptic, they leave their nodes there. And so in saying that, we describe the nocturnal planets as unlimited. So they express themselves in our everyday lives, which are very complex and nuanced all the time. Whereas these outer planets of Jupiter and Saturn and further out, we call them generational planets, but Jupiter and Saturn are called the social planets. So you have one social planet that's Mr. Grumpy and the other one that's Mr. Stabilizer, you know, that helps. And so those two planets give us the social norms that we see when we're talking about 2021. They're in Aquarius. One of the things I want to say here is that Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus, you couldn't have a better play and a better Greek play. Asclepius would be wrapping his hands together, Euripides, the whole lot, the whole scene set, if we put it back in the Greek terms, because we have Uranus, if you like, the sky god, one of the Titans, who was afraid that he was going to lose power. Now, what I'm talking about here is reflective unconscious that becomes the conscious in the way of archetypes, the way they're expressed, because here we have Uranus fearing that Kronos, his son, was gonna take over. And so, you know, he starts doing all these terrible things. What happens then is that Kronos gets with Gaia, Uranus's wife, and he does to Kronos. He gets a sickle and dethrones him, if I can use that word, dethrones him, and his genitals fall into the ocean. And of course, the mythological story is that Aphrodite is born out of that. But then Kronos goes on to do the same thing. He fears losing power. And so, he gobbles up all his children and Rhea hides Zeus. We kind of get the little Noah story happening, the put in the basket and sent down the Nile River kind of thing, those myths, those mythological myths are embedded throughout our unconscious, how Jung would express it. So we get Kronos in fear of losing power, but we get Zeus then becoming the Lord, ganging up with his brother Poseidon, Hades, and a few of his mates, Perseus, and they go on to do the conquering. So that's what we're going to see this year. That's why I've suggested the established fears itself, and that expression has been going on. But what I want to point out here, as we went through 2020, and really it started in late 2019 and moved into 2020, we saw this grab for conservative power. We saw the Kronos thing happening. We saw Pluto in there. We saw that all the planets were loaded up in Capricorn with the nodes, and this, in particular, the South Node. And so we saw this full-on load, and I don't have to tell the Capricorns and the Cancers how the last 2 years have been for them, because it's been really, really challenging, and I know how challenging that's been from my close friends. And one of the things that happens is that when Jupiter goes into Capricorn, we call him the savior in that sense. If we look at this mythological story, he was the savior. However, when he went into Capricorn, he went into fall or depression, as we call it in Hellenistic terms. And so he's exalted, the moon. But when he's in Capricorn, he's depressed, because that's where death is seen in that sense. And so he's darkened. He's down in the world with Saturn, and so therefore he cannot give what he promises. He's subdued. His powers are subdued. His old man's got him under control. And in that essence of the story, the way we see it expressed, this year, when they're moving together, and this happens, but doesn't happen very often, but it happens every now and then when Jupiter and Saturn follow each other for these conjunctions of Capricorn and then into Aquarius. Jupiter has no power. He gets a little bit more power in Aquarius because of the air element. So he has some little touch of rise. He comes out of fall and comes into Aquarius, where he can also start to stabilize and produce justice, because that's what he does. He's the judge. He's the guy that everybody came to. Sometimes you don't like that justice, but that's what Jupiter does in its sense, as an archetype expressed out into the collective. But he's still under the lordship of Saturn. And so we get 2.5 years, we get Jupiter going through Sagittarius, ironing out all of the religious problems and the philosophy problems. We saw all of the church going throughs and all that happening when Jupiter went through Sagittarius. He gets into Capricorn, and then business and all those dictators just go wild across the globe. We get a whole sense of things falling apart, but the rest of business world builds itself up while Pluto's there as well. So we've got all the brothers traveling together. This is a really interesting story from my perspective of how I see the mythology unwind and permeate as archetypes through the collective. And so now we're going to end up with Jupiter trying to express itself through Aquarius, but how it does that will be the interesting thing to observe. He will go into Pisces for a short period of time this year, but then drop back out again before he goes back in at the end of the year into Pisces, where we may start to see, use the key word, salvation, the Pisces salvation of Jupiter. However, we've still got to get through 2021. And so that's the theme of what we're going to be facing. This is the clash of the Titans, because here's Uranus in Taurus now, and playing around with the Earth. So earthquakes are going to be seen quite regularly, I think, as these guys square off with each other during this year, and a lot of volatility, because here's Uranus trying to pull everything down, and then you get the Jupiter Saturn, or the Saturn trying to hold on. So already we've seen in Russia with Putin, we've seen with Xi Jinping in China. We saw an example of trying to hold on with Trump in the US. We've seen that with Morrison here in this country. The list goes on across the world. Burma, all these countries, Thailand, all around the world, where these people of conservatism, and I'm not a politician and don't follow any political aims. I'm just seeing it and saying it the way it is. But that's the way I see it, is this holding on to power, this Saturn in Aquarius, even though Aquarius is a sign of great humanitarian, as I've said, it's a upright king, man of science, so to speak. So it's the better part, it's the brain, it's the air, it's the science of the collective in that sense. It's still a Saturn sign. Saturn wants to hold on to itself. And so sometimes it rebels against itself. And we'll witness that, I think, through 2021, the rebel against its own self. And the Republican Party reminds me of that. In that sense, it rebels against itself. So we see these archetypes expressed across the world. When these squares, 3 of them, happen this year between Saturn and Uranus, and one of the stages, Mars will be firing up against them as well. So we're going to get Leo fixed sign, Taurus fixed sign, Aquarius fixed sign. And so within that sense, we're going to get some interesting political plays for power before we get on this road to recovery as a collective, because we've been hijacked since the Capricorn positions of all of these planets moved through over the last 1.5 or 2 years. I say hijacked because the agenda of the Earth is in a critical position. No one can deny that. And I'm not pointing a finger at any kind of philosophy or any kind of politics here, but the planet is at a critical stage, and the astronomical or astrological signatures are telling us that. The archetypes are being expressed for us. Throughout history, humans have always had critical periods where they've had chances or stood at the crossroads to do things about that, to move forward. And if, as astrologers, I've heard from the prior to, we got a little example of that when Jupiter and Saturn moved into Libra in 1981, late 1980, early 1981. When the Jupiter and Saturn moved in then to Aquarius, we got into Libra, where Saturn is exalted. We got a certain amount of ideas coming forward. We got that idea that we could do these things. We could, Saturn was exalted there. We could do those things. However, as we've moved along, that chance has been lost because it was only the expression of that over that 20 years. We saw, if you look at that expression of the Jupiter Saturn, we saw the Berlin Wall come down, China. We saw all of these things that we could say, oh, okay, liberation in some sense, Libra, the weighing, if you could, of time, Chronos, we got that. But then we moved back into Taurus again, and it was more about greed, what I want for myself. And I'm not saying that in a way that's derogative. I'm just saying that's the expression of the archetype. I want to have all these lovely, luxurious things. And that's where we went. And now we have a chance to change all of those things if we can. We're at the crossroads this time. So the choices that the collective make, and we as individuals further down into our local environment and where we live, will have a significant effect on where we go over this decade. So I better stop for a second and see whether is everything okay, Ben? We're moving along all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's great, mate.
Terrific. I'm just having a little sip out of my elephant cup. So great. Yeah, look, this year is going to be a challenge to us. Those archetypes that I set forth there, the Mercury as the trickster, the contestation, the overload of information, up against these social planets that will play out as collectives. Because remember, all of this archetypal stuff I'm talking about, this gets expressed collectively across the world. However, it then feeds its way down into our own lives. And what changes about that is that we all have our own natal charts. And so where that planetary energy is in our chart, where the Taurus is, where the Aquarius is, will tell us the topic about what we're doing in that sense. But also it's how we individually wake up. And that's what we do as astrologers to try and overcome the infiltration of these archetypes. That's the whole idea of the Hermetic journey. We become conscious if we can, because collective, as Jung suggested, the collective, and Dane Rudhyar as well, the collective energy that I express in my teaching, the collective energy is on the crossroads, the yellow brick road, which is the ecliptic, and the two social planets of Jupiter and Saturn express that. So we'll see that expression across the world. How we react to it in our own individual lives will much depend on our consciousness more than anything else, because, you know, the new age, as I was about to mention before, and I jumped ahead, the new age, if you like, that we're heading into, this Aquarian age, I've heard it expressed as Uranus rules Aquarius. Well, hang on, no. Uranus is too unstable for a fixed sign. It has a correspondence with Aquarius, but only in the sense of what the expression of air is as an intellect and a human desire to do better. In that sense, you can't have a volatile planet like Uranus, a sudden exposure, a planet that turns itself upside down within 24 hours, ruling a fixed sign. It has a correspondence to it, but the way that it's expressed through evolutionary astrologers, it's like we have become new age people. We're moving ahead, which is all good and well. Our journey to consciousness is that's why we're here. But how are we going to, how that Uranian energy is expressed is through egalitarian groups. So you get this rise of egalitarian groups, this rise up against the established. And it's an interesting theme, because here's Uranus portrayed by the Greeks as the god holding on to power and fearing power, and Kronos comes along, his own son, and dethrones him in that sense. And so here we have two players doing the same thing. But the expression that most people place on Uranus is it is this planet that moves us ahead in our thinking, which is what we're going to see. But how that is expressed, I think, will be because the outer planets and Jupiter, and a planet that owns its own sign, in the sense it as a landlord or a steward, like Jupiter, like Saturn has been in Capricorn and now will be in Aquarius. It has ownership over that. So we've seen the Saturn archetype produced. That's what we're seeing for the last few years. With Uranus, we're going to get the lordship of that. And the lordship of that is going to vary because it's Venus. And so Venus is the steward of Uranus. So aspects in your own life and across the world will be influenced by Venus. Venus will have a say in how Uranus expresses itself because it's in Taurus. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys.